start off with a territorial acknowledgement. And we want to recognize that those of us hosting the call are living on stolen land. So this is land specifically of the Arawandran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And we are on land called, or we are on the Haldeman Tract. And that was land that was actually granted to the Six Nations, including 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. However, today, the Six Nations land comprises less than 5% of what was promised. And it's especially today in our conversation, it's so vital to recognize that, Canada that we live in today exists because of genocide, ongoing colonization, and violence towards Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And we need to acknowledge the connection between settler colonialism here and in Palestine. I also want to share that most of our discussion will center around government advocacy, federal elections, what a member of parliament can do in the House of Commons to help end Canadian complicity in Israeli occupation. And I do want to acknowledge that these are systems of oppression and colonial institutions. And from Turtle Island to Palestine, occupation is a crime. We must keep this in mind as we move forward in our conversation tonight, and in our ongoing work towards justice. So, as mentioned, this event is hosted by Neighbors for Palestine, Waterloo Region. We are part of a national network to pressure our government to support a free Palestine. And as a solidarity organization, we take direction from the Palestinian youth movement. So for the past 14 months, collectively, we've been pushing for a permanent ceasefire, a two-way arms embargo on Israel, and an end to the siege on Gaza. Locally, we have over 75 volunteers now across 5 different ridings in Waterloo Region. Specifically, we have focused our pressure on the 4 Liberal MPs in the region listed here, Bardish Chagger, Valerie Bradford, Brian May, Tim Lewis. And we have pressured them over the past year by organizing rallies, hosting phone zaps, canvassing in our neighborhoods and delivering petitions to our MPs, and also organizing meetings with our MPs. And due to our pressure last May, we did successfully pressure MP Tim Lewis to support an arms embargo on Israel, which was a huge, huge win for us. During this time, our guest today, MP Mike Morrice, has also been pushing our government to enact a two-way arms embargo by speaking up in Parliament and sponsoring parliamentary petitions and supporting his local community. And so why are we here today? So 2025 is a federal election year, and we are going to make Palestine an election issue in Waterloo Region. So together with the Palestinian youth movement, our main goals are number 1, to build, mobilize, and educate voters. Number 2, to pressure MP candidates to support a Palestine platform, which will be launched next week. And number 3, we really want to create opportunities to highlight Palestine during the election. And so this event's purpose is really to educate our community. We really want to make sure that people understand the electoral system, the role of an MP, and we also want to spotlight politicians that have been speaking up for Palestine, which brings me to introduce our guest tonight, MP Mike Morrice. So we're so excited to have Mike joining us today. As I mentioned, Mike has been listening to constituents, going to events, advocating vocally for a two-way arms embargo by speaking up in Parliament, and also sponsoring parliamentary petitions. Welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for a while. Good to see
Very
you all.
exciting. So my first question for you is actually about your experience in speaking up for Palestine. So I remember on October 8th, 2023, you called for a ceasefire. I think you were one of the first politicians to call for a ceasefire. And over the past year, you've been a very vocal advocate for justice in Palestine. So we're wondering, what has your experience been like in advocating for Palestine? What have the challenges been? What surprised you, and what motivates you to keep
Hmm.
speaking up?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. It's a huge, I'm not sure the right word, but it just means a lot to be offered the chance to have this conversation with you all. Really appreciate everyone for making time to be part of the conversation. Also, particularly to Neighbors for Palestine for organizing. I think as progressives, if we organize, we win. And you've had wins in the work you've done over the last number of months. And it takes a lot of work. And I really appreciate you for the work you've been doing. Um, Answering the question, um, I guess the short is that I have felt really privileged to have had the platform I've had for the last 3 and a bit years. And I've tried to use that platform to stand up for human rights, which I hear pretty broadly across folks in my community is really important to a lot of people across Kitchener Center. And standing up for human rights has meant speaking up for Sudan in the midst of the largest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. And it's also meant speaking up against the genocide in Gaza. And so I guess the experience has been one of gratitude because everyone on this call has been doing what I've been doing. In fact, most on this call have been doing more than what I've been doing. I just happen to have a platform in Parliament to be heard from and access to different parliamentary tools to try to amplify certain messages. Um, I also just feel there's an importance to being true to oneself when elected. And that's, I'm not going to be super partisan, but it is a part of why I decided to run with the Greens in the first place, is I wanted to ensure, and I didn't know the events of the last number of years would transpire, but I wanted to make sure that I could stay true to myself. And there's something to be said for living our values and sleeping at night, knowing that we did what we could with the. In fact, that was actually something that came up on one of the. So some of you folks may have been at the Walks for Grief on a lot of Saturdays. And I remember one week someone mentioned to me that she feels at the end of the day, she did what she could. And maybe that's been my hope, is I feel like I've just been trying to do what I can. And I know that's likely true for a lot of folks on this call. And if it's had some measure of an impact, I'm grateful for that. Of course, the other part of it is as I'm sure is the case for many others on this call, there is a reality that when you speak up against the Gaza and genocide in Gaza, I've been called anti-Semitic a good number of times in the last year and a bit, um, and I'll admit that that's not been very pleasant. Um, but it pales in comparison to what so many other advocates have been on the receiving end of over quite some time. So there's some parts of it, I guess, to start the conversation, but more than anything, it's just like there's been some moments where I just have felt to be in the room for some of our friendship group meetings. There's a group of MPs who meet on a regular basis called the Palestinian Friendship Group. And to have been a part of some of that organizing with other MPs across the country, I just feel really grateful for.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I guess a follow-up question I have, maybe could you speak a little bit more to, like I talked about how you've been pushing for a two-way arms embargo, speaking up
Hmm.
in Parliament. Can you speak to any of the things that we might not know that you've been doing to push for Palestine?
Yeah, well, early on in the first number of weeks back in October, the first few weeks of the genocide, there was a group of us at that friendship group who initiated, I think, the first cross-party letter of MPs who called for an arms embargo, among a number of other items. And um, I guess it's not widely talked about how kind of cross-party collaborations come together. You mentioned petitions, but I think that's probably one of the more substantial pieces of work in that we had, I don't have the number on me, but it was dozens and dozens of MPs early on who signed on to that call back in October, including MPs from all parties except the Conservatives. So Liberal MPs joined at that point. And they were just really amplifying what they were hearing from their communities, particularly from Palestinian folks and young people in particular. And it was many months. Of course, calling for a ceasefire was one of those calls. It was many months until the prime minister was able to say the word ceasefire still. But I think that there was meaningful work behind the scenes over, well, all the way through to build some of those cross-party supports. And some of that also came from you all because it was, grassroots organizers that put pressure on some MPs. But I would say early on, MPs who didn't need the pressure, who, I think was on the right side of standing up against genocide. Those MPs were coming together pretty early on. And that's also been, I guess, really meaningful to get to know some of those folks better in a number of different parties. Someone like Heather McPherson, for example, in the NDP. I've really enjoyed working with her. She's an amazing person. And I, I can see connections between some of that cross-party work and then, the support that a watered-down motion that some of you might be familiar with from March of last year ended up garnering. And of course, arms embargo was in that motion. They haven't followed the terms of that motion, so it's incremental. It's two steps forward, one steps back. But that doesn't get talked about as much. Some of those statements that tried to kind of move the needle along the way and put pressure because then you had a certain number of Liberal MPs who had signed on and others who hadn't, and I think, or the hope was that might be a point of leverage to say, if your MP is telling you that they can't do anything, well, here is something that they could have done that they didn't. Maybe then they could join that. And then others did over time join on. So yeah, I found that to be meaningful over the last little while, and I hope it helped push the government to act.
That kind of brings us to our next question for you. Can you speak to what Canada's role is in the current situation in Palestine? We also had a question from the audience
Mhm.
during registration, and people are really curious to hear how things in Parliament are going with regards to an arms embargo, especially post ceasefire.
Yeah, the second part of your question about how things are going right now is it's like the friendship group met um, earlier this week, and while we are working to put out another statement, without a parliament that's functioning, our tools to put pressure, everything from like question period to parliamentary committees, there was a lot of interventions on the state of Palestine, for example. We actually had, and Heather helped get a study started on recognizing the state of Palestine. And of course, parliamentary committees aren't operating. So it's been more difficult to have any real sense of accountability. While we do have a government, we don't have a parliament functioning. And that limits the tools available to me as, for those of you who live in Kitchener Centre, as your MP, my ability to get accountability from the government is limited right now. Um, the first part of your question, Laura, sorry, I answered
Yeah,
the second,
sorry, it
now I
was two
forgot the first.
questions. So the first part was, can you speak to what Canada's role is right
Mm.
now in the current situation in Palestine?
Yeah, that's a question that I imagine you all are quite familiar with. So first of all, of course, it's around complicity with respect to arms, and we can debate, or various government officials will debate the extent of that, but the fact is that we are currently arming a state that is committing genocide in Gaza, and so that should be ended. Um, the second role for the Government of Canada is around family reunification. It's been extremely limited, the number of families that have been reunified. Members of my community are still waiting. Family members have been killed while waiting to be reunited. And we do know that the government has offered much more generous and easier reunification programs to other countries. And this is not about bringing other countries down. It's about saying, well, why is it not the case for Palestinians in Gaza to have the kind of reunification opportunities that Ukrainian families have access to? Um, so Canada is complicit as it relates to an inability to reunify, and not that it was zero for a while; it's not zero anymore, but it is a complete inadequate response to reunifying families. I think it is important to have nuance. There is some differences in the context in Gaza than in Ukraine, and I think there's been various efforts made by the government to try to work with Israel to open up reunification, and far, far more could be done. Funding for humanitarian aid is another area where, as a result of your advocacy, the UNRWA refunding was from the Palestinian community, was from grassroots organizers that put pressure on the government when they had paused funding and now have restarted it again. That funding hasn't been increased to my knowledge, and that's another example of the complicity. International law, and where we seem to care about some states breaking international law, but not others. Our voting record at the UN, again, shifted, has changed as a result of organizing. It's also as a result of, some of you might have noticed, when Canada finally called for a ceasefire, it was days after a significant number of Muslim donors stopped donating to the Liberal Party. So it's on the ground, it's protest, it's money, it's all of the ways to put pressure on elected leaders that has shifted government positions. And that's also true, in my view, for our voting record at the UN. And the last is our foreign policy as it relates to recognizing states. And we've yet to recognize Palestine as a state. And that certainly makes it more difficult to call for human rights to be upheld, or really call for much of anything if you're not going to recognize that there is a state there to begin with.
Exactly. We have a follow-up question from the chat about the friendship group. Are you able to share how many MPs are in the Palestine friendship group?
Yeah, I wish I could. As if it's not like you pay a membership fee. I guess all MPs are welcome. I can share with you like how many have attended meetings.
Sure.
I guess
Yeah.
MPs float in and out, and I'd say maybe 30 over the course of the last 3.5 years I've seen attend friendship group meetings. And that's not to say that if you're not there, you're not supportive. I'd also, if you're looking at, which MPs are supportive, look back at that statement from back in October of 2023. It's all published. It's all on social media. And just be mindful when you see MPs only from one party signing on to a statement, those are likely ones that are only circulated within that party. It doesn't mean that MPs who aren't in that party aren't supported. It means they may never have seen it to begin with. And so there are more than 30 MPs who are standing up for Palestine on a regular basis, but I'd say about 30 who've come out to meetings of the friendship group.
That is helpful. Thank you. Another question so one of the major purposes of tonight's event is to educate people on what can an MP do to support Palestinian liberation. So we're wondering about that. And we also want to know, does it make a difference if that MP is in the governing party or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. It gets at what is an MP's job in the first place? What an MP can do is do their job, which is lift up voices of folks in their community. And an MP has a lot of different tools to do that. You mentioned petitions earlier, Laura. That is one way to do it. The asterisk on petitions is the one technicality is, as some of you might know, an MP can present a parliamentary petition, but not actually believe in what's in it and simply say, I'm lifting this up on behalf of others. But there are many other tools for an MP to lift up the voices of their community. They can put forward a motion on the floor of the House of Commons. They can show up to a committee that's studying the issue and engage with a witness to provide testimony on the state of Palestine, for example. They can show up to that friendship group and try to build cross-party support for public statements. They can speak in the media and on their social media accounts. MPs have large platforms that the media listens to. And so it'd be using a mix of their parliamentary tools and influence in the public sphere and debate to put pressure on government and lift up voices of organizers and Palestinians and folks in their community who care about human rights to move the needle on public policy.
That I think that information is powerful to have, because we there's been a lot of questions from our audience in the registration. You know, there's a lot of questions from people who are really frustrated by their MP's inaction. And so one person in the registration wrote, they want to know like what is the best way to sorry, Laura, I can't see the I can't see it. What is the best way to respond to MPs who say they can't do anything and have no power to help?
Well, I think it's doing exactly what Neighbors for Palestine has done, which is pick a specific call and have the numbers in terms of constituents of theirs put pressure through emails, meetings to advance that call. Because it's really easy for any elected person to be pretty slippery and avoid responsibility. But it's more difficult if it is as crystal clear as here is the statement, are you or are you not signing on to an arms embargo? Will you or will you not call for the state of Palestine to be recognized? So while there might be a lot of complexity in how we can put pressure on a particular action for any given MP, there are these very specific calls that you know, you wouldn't be the only person. You could join with many of your neighbors to, create some accountability around that call. And as you shared earlier, that has led to some results. It's incremental, but it is strengthened when we are organized, cohesive, and specific. And particularly when it comes from those to whom MPs are accountable to, which is their constituents. Um, Particularly when we're getting closer and closer to an election. You would think that'd be a time, most of all, where MPs would want to be demonstrating they are hearing and acting on what they're hearing from their constituents. Um, and so I think just that level of specificity is really important. And that's true here as true it is on other areas of advocacy. It's just really easy to say, I care about mental health or I care about housing, but more difficult when we can build campaigns around very specific asks and calls that either you joint seconded that motion or you didn't. Either you signed that statement or you didn't. And when we can share a joint call like that, it's more likely that that person's going to act, which I think is exactly what Neighbors for Palestine has seen over the last number of months.
Yeah, I think that's been so helpful to our movements. For people that don't know, Neighbors for Palestine is part of the Arms Embargo Now campaign, which is a massive coalition of different organizations all pushing for an arms embargo on Israel. And so it's been a game changer, I think, in our advocacy. Um, so since we're talking about advocacy right now, our next question is more about like what that looks like from an MP's perspective. So as you know, Neighbors for Palestine, you know, we've been collecting petitions, we've been meeting with MPs, we've been hosting phone zaps to pressure our MPs to call for an arms embargo. And we want to know, like, what is the effect of this advocacy from an MP's perspective, and how do we know our voices are actually being heard in their offices?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Like a year ago, I received maybe 1,000 emails on a concern that constituents in Kitchener Center had around health supplements. And I thought, wow, this is a big issue. We got to make sure we dig into this. And so my team and I did. We dug in, we tried to understand the issue better. We had a plan of what we'd propose the government to solve it. And so we emailed all 1,000 people who'd emailed us to say, join for a Zoom call so you can hear from your MP on what we're thinking of doing and we can get feedback from you on it. Uh, we had 3 people show up to that Zoom call. And that was a learning for me that sometimes when you get one of these form emails, that first of all, is it a constituent or is it somebody who's yelling at me for being anti-Semitic who lives somewhere else? I've never met and never will. Um, and then is this person really engaged? And I think MPs who've been doing this for longer than I have maybe have a better pulse on that. And so I think in that advocacy, when you write a personal email that comes from you, when you include your postal code, When you ask for a meeting and say, I've got 5 neighbors on my street who want to join for this meeting, um, when you demonstrate that you're kind of invested in that issue and there are others who are also invested, I think that's different than, and I'm not saying that these form email campaigns aren't also important, um, but there's kind of like there's a two-way street to it, I guess, to demonstrate the extent to which this is important to you, that you are engaged in it, and that you're going to call for real accountability. Um, I think you might hopefully see some of that. And I don't want to overset expectations for some of my colleagues. Maybe some of them are doing some certain math on whether they think they might ever get your vote. And um, for my part, though, um, that's something that we're trying to stay attuned to is this a real person, and would they actually want to talk about it? And would championing this be me doing my job as an MP?
Thank you. Um, I want to kind of stick on the advocacy theme that we're in right now. So this is more about like how can someone advocate? So is anyone allowed to talk to their MP about issues like this? How do you go about doing that effectively? I think you kind of answered that question. But one really important question is like, what if you're not a Canadian citizen?
Hmm.
What are the effects of that?
So, first of all, yes, anyone can advocate to their MP. Make sure you know who your MP is. Maybe we could put a link in the chat to the Our Commons page where you could type your postal code. I think it's just Our Commons and then click on members, and there's a postal code field. It'll tell you who your MP is. So make sure you're engaging with the right person. Of course, in terms of accountability, I think it's fair to say that the accountability is greater if you are a Canadian citizen who is eligible to vote in an election, because that is how our democracy works in Canada today. However, and those who are not citizens can still choose to engage and create accountability mechanisms in elections. I like to remind permanent residents that they can still put out a lawn sign, for example, and demonstrate their support for a particular person. One of the 2 campaign managers of my campaign in 2021 was a permanent resident. You can still knock on doors. You can show up and engage in this democracy as a permanent resident. And I think that might also help demonstrate to an MP why they should be caring about hearing from you. I guess relatedly, MPs can also help advocate for their constituents who are engaging with various federal departments, including immigration. And so I think it's also important for those who care about our democracy that we remind those who are not citizens that if they have applied for citizenship, for example, doesn't matter who you vote for, your MP's job is still to advocate for you for that application to move through Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. And I worry that many permanent residents don't know that that's the case and would never think that they could do that. Um, but it is a core part of an MP's job is to do that kind of casework on behalf of citizens and non-citizens. So certainly when it comes to Neighbors for Palestine, for example, I hope someone who might not be a citizen doesn't feel held back from their ability to organize, because I think their voices are really important, and I think our democracy is stronger when they might choose to.
I liked what you or how you brought up like other ways to engage politically other than just voting. So I think that's super, super important, um, especially right now. Seeing as we're talking about voting, I think we'll talk a little bit about um, how sometimes, there's so many important issues that you deal with as an MP, right? And that we all care about as well. Um, Oftentimes people are critical of like single issue voters, but increasingly Palestine is being seen as more than just a single issue. It has really become, a nexus of issues like freedom of expression and assembly, environmentalism, colonialism, surveillance, increasing hate crimes, so many connections. Can you speak to how you see that playing out globally and in Canada?
Well, I think you've all seen how the extent to which it's not often that you see the government's policy change as quickly as it has, or I should reframe that, change at all in response to grassroots organizing. It, take electoral reform and those who are engaged in advocating for electoral reform and the decades and decades it's taken to move a little bit, and then we take a step back and then we go further. So while it's incremental and insufficient, if you look at what was agreed to in that motion from back in March and how much further ahead the terms of that motion was than the government's position the day before, and while it was also diluted from the original motion, and all of cabinet signed on to that, and that was as a result of enough MPs feeling that pressure that the nexus of issues you described, Laura, and the number of people um, was sufficient to push them. Even the fact, it was the NDP who brought forward that motion. I think they get one motion every 4 to 6 months. The fact that the NDP chose that as their motion, they could have chosen anything, and they chose human rights in Gaza as their item. That demonstrates again the extent to which progressives certainly are feeling that pressure, and I think MPs across the country. Um, it's certainly been in the public discourse more than any time in my lifetime, and so that I think is something that is constructive. That you can even point to a win. Not always in the course of 3 years is it possible to even point to a win, and that's I think again because of the number of people in positions like mine who recognize that they might not have their jobs if they're not on the right side of this. Um, mhm.
So let's talk about the election. An election's coming up. Our first question is, what are the stakes for Palestine and for Canada's complicity in genocide, and the ramifications from that in the federal election that we are likely to see this spring? So really, like, what are the stakes right now?
I guess twofold. You can talk about the stakes. You can also talk about the opportunity that an election presents. So the stakes are significant. If we look at the two major parties who have the greatest chance of forming government, and um, one is a party that has a lot to be criticized and um, has fallen short. Um, the other, I send you clips of their MPs who will reject the idea that Israel is breaking international law at all. Um, and so, yes, significant stakes when we think about who might form government. But to me, the opportunity here is that groups like Neighbors for Palestine and other grassroots organizers have been focused on putting pressure and shifting the opinions of a small number of people over the last 3.5 years. Well, every 4 years ago, we get to decide who those people are going to be. And so maybe I might be a bit biased, but to me, campaigns and elections can be really exciting because they're huge opportunities to set out who's going to be at that table for the next up to 4 years. And we could get a whole lot more, and I will be nonpartisan about this, more MPs elected in a variety of parties, including in the Liberal Party, who could be strong advocates. MP Selma Zahid, for example, from Scarborough, who is a Liberal MP, in my view, has done a lot of meaningful work when it comes to standing up for Palestinian human rights the last number of years. Um, and so we will have an election in this country, likely called sometime in the next 3 weeks. And the election will happen either in April or in May. And after that point, as we just had with the provincial election, now it's back to, okay, here's the set of MPPs we need to advocate to. But in the midst of that election, It's a question of who's it going to be. And my experience has been, as somebody who ran for office and lost and then ran a second time, that the reason I got elected was because enough people cared enough to put the time, energy, and money to support my candidacy. And I don't know how long I'll get to do this for. There's not much job security in it. But elections are really powerful times for grassroots advocates to not just have their voices heard, but put their time, energy, money towards the people they want to see continue in this work in this way. Because, of course, there's much else that is done in civil society. But I think the people who are in our parliament right now is we really care who those people are, or we should.
Exactly. And I think that's why our national campaign is really using this election to platform Palestine and to really ramp up our efforts in order to help get Palestine champions elected and to try and avoid to get people that are extremely complicit um, elected as well. And so um, we'll be really busy over the next couple months organizing and really pressuring our candidates for throughout this election. Um,
Can I
I
offer some
guess,
specifics on that, Laura, just
yeah,
while we're
please.
here?
Yeah,
Just so for folks to be mindful of, if you're thinking about supporting a candidate in any riding in Waterloo Region, something to be mindful of is of what is most helpful to that person. Um, my opinion on this, the most helpful things is actually your time. Um, if you have time to offer a candidate, uh, I was out knocking on doors today. I'm going back out tomorrow. Um, I had three people I was knocking on doors with today. I think there might be one or two signed up for tomorrow. Um, Offering your time to help someone to reach more people to connect with is a really significant way to support their candidacy. Um, and so that's one thing to consider when a candidate comes by and says, "Hey, are you open to taking a lawn sign?" That is another. For those of us in Kitchener Center in the last election, you saw one party had a lot of lawn signs out, and it really did help show people that that was a viable option for them. Um, and for those that maybe, you're feeling really busy, and you're not sure you want to put anything on your lawn or you want to do something else in addition, making financial contributions is really helpful. It's what pays for those signs. It what pays for a campaign office. And the earlier you do it, the more that that person can plan around that expense and can think about a lease for an office, for example. And the good news is in Canada, we have actually pretty good laws around financing of elections, much better than the US. The maximum somebody can put in as an individual, even if the person's a millionaire, the maximum is around $1,700. And what that means, it's some may critique that's still too high, but it does mean that if you can contribute $20 or $40, that that does have an impact, and it does help that person more than you might expect. And again, the sooner if you make the donation on election day, it's kind of hard to plan around that. So those are some of the examples of ways that I don't care what party, but if you find somebody who's going to be a champion for Palestine, um, those are some very specific things you could consider doing, along with even just talking to friends, because most of us have some distrust of advertisements, first of all. Some might have distrust of mainstream media, but I think what we trust the most is our closest family and friends. And speaking again to my experience, I think that was a big part of my getting elected last time is that enough people were willing to say, "Hey, I actually have met that person. Here's what I know of that person," and that really does go a long way.
thank you. I think one thing we've been talking about with the Neighbors for Palestine is like the election, because our whole point is to pressure MPs, right, to support justice in Palestine. And so the election really is an opportunity to determine who our opponent is. And it's been uh, I'm going to be honest, it's been really nice not having to pressure you because you're doing all the things that we would expect an MP to do, to listen to their constituents and to support human rights. And so now we only have to pressure three or four out of the five MPs in the region. And it would be great to not have to pressure anyone. But yeah, the election I think is a huge huge thing coming up. Um, there is a question in the chat too. So you probably get hundreds of messages from constituents every week. What does it take to break through the noise and for something to register as a key issue?
I'll speak to my own experience. Um, it just takes one person. I do get a lot of messages, hundreds a day. But then if you cut out those that aren't from constituents, and then if you only look at the ones that are actual emails and not a form that maybe the person forgot. In fact, it was my partner over the Christmas holidays said, "Oh, Mike, your team just wrote back to me about an issue that I forgot I even filled out a form, and I guess it went to your office." If you actually write the email, in my case, every time somebody writes us an email, we write them back and we offer a follow-up conversation if they want to talk about it. And if the person says they want to talk about it, then we set up a call. And last summer I learned about that people with disabilities have some services that are tax exempt if they're in person, but if they're online, they're not. And because of this one person who reached out and she informed me that this was an issue, we then started a petition, got some coverage in the record on it. It wasn't like I didn't do it because 100 people had to email me. I learned about it from one person who cared, who put her time in, who spent the time to educate me, and we then kind of worked together to figure out how we do something about it. Um, and so yeah, I guess there's a lot of talk of like how do you get through, and there's a lot of messages, but I would also encourage you to consider it as a two-way street. And if you're willing to put that time and energy in, of course, there's strength in numbers. But I would expect most MPs would have a similar approach to having a conversation with most constituents who reach out. Now, if you flame me and all this, it makes it more difficult. Um, but I think most MPs are willing to have a conversation. Um, I shouldn't go that far. That's the case for me. I'll let you, I shouldn't assume other experience. What is true, what is definitely capital T true, is there is strength in numbers in our democracy. And if you haven't heard back on your email, try finding five people who might send the same email and CC everyone else. And I expect that will increase your chances of a good result.
I was going to say, I don't know if every MP is like that, Mike.
Yeah, and the truth is, again, first past the post is it's got a lot of issues, and one of them is that there are some ridings in this country that the person knows, regardless of what they do, they're going to get reelected every time. And so we need proportional representation for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is it creates more accountability. It shouldn't be that you only get a response back if your MP only won by a certain number of votes. Um, that is unfortunate. In Waterloo Region, there are in each riding different levels of accountability based on the voting habits of that riding, and that's not right. So I guess I don't get through too many conversations without talking about the importance of electoral reform, sometimes multiple times. I apologize for that here, but I do think it's important we think about our democracy. And there's only three countries left who still use first past the post. We're one of those three: US, UK, and us are the big three that um, need to be thinking about how we shift away. We tried putting pressure on that. We can talk, it's a whole separate chat, but it's really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Those are the main questions that we came up with. We do have a lot of questions from the audience as well. So our first one is, do you think the fear of censure is stopping other leaders from speaking out? Is there a general sense of fear in regards to going against a party stance?
Um, Generally speaking, on the risk of censure, I'd say no. That was a pretty flagrant, undemocratic action taken by the legislature in Ontario that fairly unprecedented, and I don't expect is likely, and there's a lot we can say about how unjust and undemocratic that was. Um, there are various other mechanisms, and this person is getting at one of them, which is party discipline. It's on the order of like 99.5% of the time MPs vote along party lines. And part of that is the kind of reward mechanisms in large parties. If you want to be promoted to be a junior minister or a chair of a committee, it's often because you have followed the party line. And so some MPs will choose to advocate in confidential formats within caucus meetings, for example. And you and I have no accountability or don't know what was said in those caucus meetings, and they could then tell you that they said the right thing, but who really knows? So again, it's partly why I made the choice I did. Um, I wanted to make sure that I could say in this session that's recorded what I really mean and feel, and that might change based on what I learned. I've actually learned a lot. There's some folks on this call who have taught me a lot about Palestine over the years, and that has helped strengthen some of my resolve. And there's issues that I've shifted my position on over the years too, because I learn, and that to me is a good thing. I don't think that because you're in one party and you share values means that you all should vote the same way all the time. Um, it's probably why I give kudos to some. I don't agree with their choice of the party they've chosen to run with, but some MPs in the Liberal Party who have, put a lot of their time, effort, and energy around advocating for Palestine within caucus. I admire that. Um, but I do think we should be pushing back against that kind of party discipline, and it does make it more difficult. It kind of relates to your earlier question, Laura, about like, should we only advocate to those in the governing party? Of course, my answer is no. And I think it's important. One of the reasons why I think it's important advocating to all parties is because we want um, all parties to feel this pressure and to it'd be nice if, regardless of which party's in power, you've got some stability in policy. We thought we had that when it comes to, I thought we had that in the carbon price for a while, and we lost that recently. Um, but so that's why I think you should be advocating. It's in our best interest to advocate to MPs in all parties. And we should celebrate. That's something else we could consider doing. Celebrate the MPs who break party line. One example is Nate Ernskine-Smith. Um, he's probably the first I can think of where he has voted against the party at times and got promoted to cabinet. It's very, very rare that we see that in this country, and often the response from the media is like if Elizabeth and I vote differently, it's oh my gosh, there's a split in the Green Party, and no, there's no. It's just Saanich Gulf Islands in BC is different than Kitchener Centre, and we are of the same values and focused on our communities, and we should celebrate MPs when they focus and put their communities first. And I think if we did that, it would reduce the power that the parties have.
It feels like every way that you answer a question brings me to our next question. Like it
Right.
just it's perfect.
Right.
So we're talking about, you know, supporting your community, right? And so we have a few questions from our audience about your next steps with regards to Palestine, both in Parliament and locally. So locally, I'll ask the question first. How often do you intend to meet, and have you been meeting with Palestinians in the region to maintain those open lines of communication?
Yeah, I think it's so important. Not just the open lines of communication, which are important, but my experience has been that my advocacy has always been stronger when it's rooted in the experience of folks in our community who might have a lived experience around that issue. And so when I have been advocating around an arms embargo, I think it's been stronger when I've been able to say I spoke with so and so, or around family reunification, and I can speak about the specific family and their experience and what they shared with me about the trauma of their sibling or parent being in Gaza right now or wherever they happen to be nearby. So that has been really important, I think, for strengthening the advocacy. Partly why I try to show up in our community is that people might then feel more comfortable to reach out because not everybody feels comfortable sending an email. So that's from knocking on doors to just being at the market on a Saturday. I hope that that means that then there's that connectivity, and then there's some intentionality. Again, the Walks for Grief have been one that is co-organized by the Palestinian community alongside really strong organizers. And I find just by walking, I get to hear different experiences from the Palestinian community, and actually learn also about some, the shifting dynamics that I might not always be attuned to. I can be hearing it from folks who are on that walk or somebody who might send me an email. So I just think that's our democracy at work. It's so important. Um, Federal ridings are large. I represent about 115,000 people. Um, and so don't forget that it is um, a lot of people that person's trying to make sure that they're connecting with. But I think that that rootedness in community does strengthen the advocacy most of all. And that's why I've tried to keep that open throughout.
Yeah, I feel like you're at like all the important events, which is amazing. For those that don't know, the Walk with Grief is hosted every Saturday morning at the Kitchener Market, and it's run by the Waterloo Region Friends of Palestine. So you can check that out if you'd like as well. Um, so the next question is more in regards to Parliament. So what do you think will be your next step in trying to further Palestinian human rights um, and peace in Gaza while in Parliament?
I'm really hoping we get one last statement from this friendship group. I can't share more specifics because it's not finalized yet, but some of us are preparing for the earliest possible election date, which would be next Monday, is the earliest election. There will be a new leader of the Liberal Party, which or should mean a new prime minister. And opposing parties have told the media that they intend on voting down the government on March 24th. So they kind of have 2 weeks to choose to have an election before an election likely being forced by the other parties. So my hope is we can try to get this one letter done before the election that offers some very clear calls from MPs on all parties, um, partly to help show folks there are MPs in different parties who have been and continuing to call for an arms embargo, for example. I thought we were making real progress when it comes to Palestinian statehood. There was some shifting rhetoric from the government. There was that parliamentary committee. That committee, I was hoping, would recommend it. We had a motion from MP McPherson. Um, Unfortunately, we were prorogued, and so a lot of that work gets wiped out. Uh, but I also want to be honest that there isn't much time left for Parliament. Myself as an MP right now, or Parliament, which is barely even functioning or isn't functioning as Parliament is meant to, in the coming days. So I think one statement is kind of the next big thing I'm trying to make sure it gets out. And then my hope is I have put my name forward to continue serving our community as our MP for Kitchener Centre, and so I hope to continue this work should I get reelected.
And we hope you do. Um, this question is I don't know how you're gonna want to answer it, but we're wondering, have you managed to have any constructive conversations with other MPs who have not been vocal in their support for Palestine?
I would say yes, constructive, sure. Um, However, there's been several conversations which have been very unconstructive. Um, and if you're looking to get a sense of where different MPs stand, I'd look at the public statements. Like there isn't a hidden secret MP who hasn't signed on to a public statement, but in fact does want an arms embargo. I think that's something that we should be recognizing the importance of national groups that have rallied these calls, is it does create very clear accountability. Particularly helpful, I think, leading up to an election to get a sense of, is your MP's name on that list? If your MP hasn't called for an arms embargo, if they haven't joint seconded MP McPherson's motion, if they didn't vote for the watered down version of the NDP motion in March of last year, they aren't like secretly hiding but supporting. Um, it makes it very clear, thanks to primarily the work of grassroots organizers, to identify those MPs who either were there to begin with, or also really great, maybe have come alongside in time since as a result of public pressure. Um, I think that's where we should focus it, because you can see plenty of unconstructive debate in the House of Commons where something as simple as saying the word genocide or calling out violations of human rights very quickly um, erode into just complete, nonsense.
Absolutely. Speaking of nonsense, um, do you think that the recent changes in the US-Canada relationship will affect Canada's position or role in Palestine? This is another question from the
I, th-
audience.
I think it speaks to the point you were making, Laura, earlier that I know Neighbors for Palestine is focused on, which is this idea of in Waterloo Region having Palestine be an election issue. Uh, um, I think it is more difficult as a result of the tariffs today. Um, if you think about kind of the public discourse when something this economically devastating is front of mind, and folks might be losing their jobs, it will be more difficult to get attention in the media of MPs. Um, and so I hope that strengthens your resolve, that your advocacy is really important right now. And I don't believe in this idea of like competing one progressive idea over another. Uh, I appreciate, Laura, how you made those interconnections earlier, and I know that that's true for a lot of folks on this call. We have a lot of needs as individuals, and one of those needs is to have a government that is on the right side of human rights, and the other is to ensure that our neighbors aren't losing their jobs in the midst of a trade war. Um, but we also need to recognize that your organizing will be needed when there is so much happening in the world right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we're we're grappling with right now, with like our canvassing teams is like how can we talk about Palestine um, to to make this like really relevant for everyone, for like a random person on the street, right?
If I can offer, I would just encourage you all just to stay focused.
Yeah.
Um, I don't, we don't need to, sorry, my opinion
No,
for
go
you to
ahead.
consider
Yeah.
would be just to keep the energy going for those for whom they want, and even just tonight, the fact that 60 people on a Tuesday night amidst of childcare and jobs and shoveling all the things that might competing for your time with right now. The fact that 60 people showed up on a Zoom call to stare into some glass to talk about something as important as Palestine, I think demonstrates the amount of grassroots energy in our community. So keep putting that to work while we also take care of our neighbors who might be going through a job loss or might see the price of essentials go up at the grocery store. We can be doing both at the same time. And I hope that you choose to continue to organize, particularly at a time as important as a federal election, for many different candidates who will put their names forward to continue to be advocates for Palestine.
Very well said. Thank you. Okay, a few more questions. Just so everyone knows, we have you until 8:15, I believe. Is that okay, Mike?
Fine for me. Hope if others want to
Okay,
stay on, yeah, for sure.
awesome, awesome. Okay, so we'll ask a few questions. Okay, so there are a number of companies in our region. In fact, there's over six weapons companies that directly supply parts for F-35 fighter jets that are that have been bombing people in Gaza. We protested at one of these companies in November as part of the F-35 Day of Action. The question is, what actions can be taken against these companies by you as an MP and by us as individuals?
It's a great question. As an MP, my lines of accountability are strongest to the federal government. That's where I have the privileges and tools as a result of being elected by folks in my community. And so um, that's where calls like the government's position on the state of Palestine, that's a very direct line. I have, direct access to the Minister of Foreign Affairs that sets that policy. There are parliamentary committees where I could then question that minister on that issue. And tomorrow, she could choose to recognize this, that Canada could recognize the state of Palestine tomorrow. Um, so that's a very direct connection to public policy of the federal government. When it comes to weapons manufacturers, there's less of a direct line of connection. And so that's where I'd kind of lean on you all if organizers can help me see where I could leverage that. What I want to avoid doing is misleading to say, oh, I can take care of that when it might not be the case. Um, so that's not as clear to me, but certainly support the work that organizers are doing in a variety of ways to different entities. Um, and my direct line is to the federal government.
I guess I'll kind of also add a little bit of an answer to that question too. So as part of the F-35 Day of Action, we specifically protested at these companies, not necessarily to protest the companies themselves, but to use those companies to protest the federal government to enact an arms embargo. So if Canada, implemented a two-way arms embargo tomorrow, those companies would not be sending weapons components to Israel. And so it's one thing to kind of like go, company by company by company, right? But another one to really try and like implement that very much needed arms embargo. So no more sending weapons to Israel.
And that's again why I think that campaign is so important, is it's agnostic of where the weapons are coming from. It's you having your voice heard on your federal government, your taxpayer money, and where that money is going, and that you don't want to see it supporting a genocide. Direct, powerful, clear. I think it's why we've seen some success. It's also why we've seen the government muddying the waters. I've debated this at length on the floor of the House of Commons. Some of you may have seen some of the talk of whether it's lethal or non-lethal and some of the jargon from global affairs on what specifically is being procured. So they have, I think, muddied the waters. I think they know that when they make it more complicated, most folks tune out and think, oh, they did the right thing. They signed the motion. We checked that box. But I think that's partly why, Laura, that campaign has been so important and has had some measure of success.
Okay. Um, yeah, no, I'm just so grateful for this conversation. I think it's been so helpful. I know I've learned a lot. Um, Also really grateful for you speaking up, in places like the House of Commons. Like I feel like there is so much we can do as individuals as well in a movement, but it is also really powerful to see, the same things that we're saying in Parliament, right? Um, okay, so there's a few, maybe like two more questions. Another question we have is, are there any rules around sitting MPs traveling on CEJA-sponsored trips to Israel? Is there anything we can do to end this practice?
Yes, there is increased pressure to get rid of sponsored trips altogether. And it's not specific to CEJA. It's a broader movement right now of Canadians who are saying, is it right that a third party could pay for an MP to travel to a particular location, often a sunny, nice destination? And would it not be reasonable to expect that if an MP is paid to travel somewhere, that that might influence their perspective? So, particularly as it relates to foreign interference and the kind of acceptable forms of engagement with MPs, sponsored travel is just a way of saying a third party entity pays for that MP to go to some faraway place, helps set the agenda for them. And I do think MPs benefit from travel. Some MPs have been to Gaza. Personally, I just don't think anybody else should pay for it to happen, and that would remove any potential conflict of interest. So that was coming up more when foreign interference was in the news a lot. Now that foreign interference is in the news a bit less, we're hearing less about it. But there is a number of MPs who've spoken out against sponsored travel. Elizabeth May is one of them. And it's a practice that personally I feel we should end. And I haven't, for what it's worth, in terms of my accountability, I've done no sponsored travel.
Is there is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, maybe the last closing comment would just be to encourage everyone to do some research on candidates in Waterloo Region who are pro-Palestine. And those include Green candidates. I expect it will include some NDP candidates as well. And anything we can do to have some form of um, shared support around progressive candidates in different parts of Waterloo Region. Um, Personally, I think that is constructive. Um, I'll note we do have Simon Guthrie on the call today, who happens to be a Green running in Waterloo. Um, and there are others in other parties across Waterloo Region um, that are folks that would benefit from translating some of the hopes that folks on this call might have to some of the very practical supports that these people will need who have chosen to put themselves on the line, but nobody gets elected. And it's more difficult as a Green or as an NDP to do so without a ton of grassroots support. And so I just really appreciate the Neighbors for Palestine. I'm not sure how much this was coincidence or just perfect timing that was so well planned, but the timing of this call is so good uh, because for everyone who might be listening live or online afterwards, if you care and have been advocating for a number of years, we are entering a 2 or 3 month period where you could choose to put your time towards somebody that could then spend their time for 4 years with a very public platform, hopefully doing you proud. And when that happens, that's when our democracy is working well. Um, and so I'd encourage you to consider looking at who those candidates are. I know we got some folks from outside of Waterloo Region as well. And so for folks who are outside of Waterloo Region, I encourage you to do the same thing, particularly in ridings where there is the possibility of a shift from um, what might have typically been the case in one of the two large parties, to look into that now because this is a moment for you to have your voice heard in a really significant way and to support someone who could do something really meaningful. And join that friendship group. As I mentioned earlier, it would be nice to have some more allies at the end of this election as a result of your advocacy.
I'm so glad you talked about, trying to, rally again, or not rally against, rally for candidates who are supportive of Palestine. Um, as part of Neighbors for Palestine's goals over the next couple of months is we do want to um, meet with candidates. We want to we want to learn about their stance on Palestine, and then we want to educate the community about each candidate, whether they are supportive or whether they are not supportive. So after this event, if you registered for this event through Action Network, you will be getting lots of more emails from us about our election campaigns, about our election efforts, and how you can help to pressure candidates to support Palestine. Um, we also will send a follow-up email with a link to the recording as soon as it's ready. There's going to be lots more information coming out as we prepare to make Palestine an election issue this year. We have one last question for you, Mike. Do you have any last advice for folks on this call who are watching it later on YouTube, who are maybe nervous about talking to MPs or candidates? Any advice for them?
Love that question. I would encourage you to think about whatever brings you joy and how that could manifest to have strong champions for Palestine elected in the next election. I remember someone early on telling me, "Oh, Mike," she said, "I've got my fingers crossed for you." And I tried to very politely remind and encourage her that fingers crossed don't win elections, but thank you for the support. Um, and so for some people, like if I can just be real, I know that knocking on doors and talking to someone you've never met before might be so far outside someone's comfort zone. It's just not something that might be possible for you. But maybe baking some cookies might be something that might bring you joy. I can tell you, canvassers are hungry at the end of a time of going out knocking on doors in the cold. Maybe my partner's kids are younger, 6 and 4. They joined for a sign wave for Ashland. You might have seen some folks in Kitchener who are waving green signs around. That was something that we could do as a family that involved them in politics in a way that we felt was appropriate for the kids. And that, we heard a lot of people who say, "Oh, I saw you on the corner, and that reminded me to make sure I voted that day." Think about the ways that maybe you feel lit up and recognize, and let me just affirm for you that it doesn't have to be emailing your MP as the only way to engage. It might be working behind the scenes with I know Neighbors for Palestine is looking for more organizers. Calls like this don't just magically happen. It takes hours and hours of unpaid labor to make this kind of call happen. Like being somebody behind the scenes that might be tracking an email list. There's so much work that goes on, and I'd encourage you to just reflect on what you enjoy doing and how either grassroots organizers or candidates in the next election might benefit from that and reach out to that person. Because my sense is that's the renewable energy. When we spend time doing something that aligns with our values and that lights us up, we do more of it. I love knocking on doors. I'm going to do more of that tomorrow. But if you love something else, I hope you find some time for it. We had a lot of last campaign, like a dad and his daughter who joined for like a weekly canvas, for example. If you enjoy doing it with a friend, I find community, food, and organizing to be things that can be really life-giving in the midst of despair. And if you're tracking the news on Gaza, it can feel pretty despairing a lot of the time. I hope for some of you, being here tonight, organized with Neighbors for Palestine, might be the antidote to that. And I hope you continue to find those antidotes in the ways that that give you some joy.
Thank you so much, Mike. This has been a joy for me, honestly. Organizing with Neighbors for Palestine and also seeing you doing such amazing work, and actually listening to your constituents, and really doing what is right and speaking up for Palestine and for human rights. So thank you again for all of your work. Thank you so much for being here and spending your evening with all of us and helping us to learn a little bit more about what it's like to be an MP behind the scenes and what our advocacy, what the effects of our advocacy can do in the government. So thank you so much again. And thank you to everyone who has joined us tonight. It's been an absolute joy to see how many people are here. And just like Mike said, like we encourage you to to get involved and find your joy because it can be really, really an isolating and a time of despair. And what we have found at Neighbors for Palestine is a community of people who who deeply care and who support each other while supporting Palestine. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.